Every major economic disruption of the last century produced the same split. A small group came through financially intact, sometimes even stronger. Everyone else absorbed the damage reactively, adjusting too late, paying the compounded price of delay. Researchers who studied household behavior across the 1973 oil crisis, the 2008 collapse, and the 2020 pandemic found that the dividing line wasn't income. It wasn't intelligence. It was timing. Specifically, whether people had built the psychological and behavioral architecture to respond before the pressure arrived. That architecture is what separates the 1% from everyone else, and it can be built. Starting now, think about the last major economic warning you ignored. Not because you didn't hear it. You heard it. You read the articles, maybe shared one. You felt a low-grade unease for a day or two, then filed it somewhere in the back of your mind under things to deal with eventually and moved on. That's not a character flaw. That's a feature of the human nervous system operating exactly as designed. The problem is that the design is outdated. Psychologists call it normalcy bias. It's the mind's default tendency to interpret new threats through the lens of the most recent stable period you've experienced. When you encounter a warning, a headline, a data point, an economist projection, your brain doesn't process it in isolation. It compares it to your most recent baseline. If you survived the last inflation spike, the last market correction, the last geopolitical scare with your life broadly intact, your nervous system files the new warning under similar to that, probably fine. It does this automatically. It does this before you've consciously processed a single word of the warning itself. This is why knowing doesn't equal ready. They feel identical from the inside, which is what makes the gap so expensive. In the months leading up to the 2008 financial collapse, a Federal Reserve survey found that more than 60% of American households reported being aware of tightening credit conditions and rising mortgage risk. Aware. They knew. They had heard the same warnings being broadcast on every financial news channel, and yet fewer than 15% had made any material adjustment to their household finances, their emergency reserves, their debt load, their investment exposure. The gap between those two numbers, between knowing and adjusting, is where most of the damage happened. Families who understood intellectually that something was wrong, but whose nervous systems had classified the threat as similar to before, probably manageable, watched their net worth contract by tens of thousands of dollars in less than 12 months. This is not a story about financial literacy. Those households weren't uninformed. They were running the same cognitive software as everyone else, and that software has one catastrophic blind spot. It is optimized for individual threats, not convergence. Here's what that means in practice. When a single risk arrives, a job loss, a market correction, an unexpected expense, most people can adapt. The threat is legible. It has a shape. You can build a response around a single thing. What the human risk assessment system struggles with, almost universally, is the simultaneous arrival of multiple stressors that interact with each other. Each one, viewed in isolation, seems survivable. Mapped together, they compound in ways that become genuinely difficult to absorb. A 2020 study tracking household financial behavior during the first year of the pandemic found something that should concern you. Households that experienced income disruption alone recovered significantly faster than households that experienced income disruption paired with even one additional stressor: a health event, a major car repair, a shift in housing costs. The second stressor didn't just add to the damage, it multiplied it. And the households least prepared for the compounding weren't the ones with the lowest incomes. They were the ones who had mentally filed the original threat as singular, who had built their response around one thing going wrong at a time. The researchers described this as a resilience architecture failure, not a money failure, a mental model failure. Most people right now are building their mental model around one thing, whatever the most visible headline is, the number on the gas pump, the current stock index level, the most recent Fed statement. They're anchoring to the most legible data point and using it as a proxy for the full picture. And because that data point feels uncomfortable but manageable, Their normalcy bias files the whole situation under temporary, probably survivable, check back in a few months. That filing's wrong, not because any one of the visible pressures is necessarily catastrophic on its own, but because what's actually building isn't one pressure. It's a set of pressures arriving on different timelines, each one interacting with the others, each one reducing your capacity to absorb whatever comes next. By the time the full picture becomes legible, by the time it's obvious enough that your nervous system drops the probably fine classification, most of the window for low-cost adjustment will already be closed. And this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the people who are going to get hurt most in what's coming aren't the people who are ignorant of the risks. They're the people who are aware of them, who have read the same things you've read, who feel the same ambient unease you probably felt when you clicked on this video, and who have done nothing materially different as a result. Awareness without behavioral adjustment isn't preparation. It's the illusion of preparation, and the illusion is more dangerous than ignorance because it removes the urgency that ignorance would have created. There's a version of this story where that's the whole problem, where normalcy bias is the villain and understanding it is the solution. If the only thing arriving were a single identifiable threat, even a serious one, the fix would be straightforward. Name the threat, override the bias, adjust, done. But that's not what's happening, and that would be enough. If what's coming were just one thing, it isn't one thing. What's building right now is a convergence of 4 distinct pressures, each arriving on its own timeline, each one interacting with the others in ways that make the total damage significantly larger than the sum of the parts. Energy costs are already here. Food price increases are arriving now, embedded in supply chains that haven't repriced yet at the shelf. Interest rate expectations have shifted fundamentally, repricing the cost of every dollar of debt carried by every household in America. And a broader consumer confidence contraction, the behavioral freeze that follows sustained uncertainty, is already underway in the data, even if it hasn't arrived visibly in your own life. 4 things, 4 timelines, and your mind is almost certainly processing them as one. There's a concept in behavioral economics called the conjunction fallacy. It was first documented by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in a landmark 1983 study, and it describes one of the most reliable failures in human probabilistic reasoning. When people are asked to estimate the likelihood of a single event, they tend to be reasonably calibrated. But when asked to estimate the likelihood of multiple events occurring together, something breaks down. People consistently rate the conjunction, both things happening simultaneously, as more probable than either individual event. Not because they're doing the math wrong, because narrative coherence overrides probability logic. A story that hangs together feels more likely than a cold statistical estimate. The conjunction fallacy works in reverse too. When multiple stressors are arriving simultaneously, but each one feels individually manageable, the mind tends to underestimate the compounded probability that all of them will affect you at once. You're not wrong that you can handle an energy price spike alone. You're not wrong that you've absorbed grocery inflation before. The error is assuming those assessments remain valid when both are happening at the same time, alongside 2 more pressures you haven't fully priced in yet. Nobody is framing this correctly right now. The financial media covers each thread separately. Energy analysts talk about oil. Agricultural economists talk about food supply chains. Fed watchers talk about rate trajectory. Consumer sentiment researchers talk about the behavioral freeze. Rarely do any of them map how the threads interact, how the energy shock feeds the food shock, how the food shock accelerates the behavioral freeze, how the behavioral freeze arrives just as borrowing costs stop offering any relief. The full picture requires holding all 4 threads simultaneously, and that is precisely what the human risk assessment system struggles to do under pressure. So let's do it here. The energy layer is the most visible because it arrived fastest. Fuel costs for commercial transportation are significantly elevated, which means the cost of moving everything, food, materials, finished goods, has increased. That's not a prediction. That's already embedded in the logistics contracts being renegotiated this quarter. The grocery layer follows with a delay. typically 4 to 8 weeks for perishables, longer for shelf-stable goods, because retailers absorb margin compression before they reprice. That window is closing. When it closes, the sticker price catches up fast. One supply chain economist at Northwestern noted that retailers have been running on compressed margins for months and have almost no cushion left to absorb a second input cost shock. The interest rate layer is the one most people have mentally filed as abstract. Rates are high? Yes. But borrowing costs only become viscerally real when you need to borrow. A mortgage, a car loan, a business line of credit, a balance transfer to manage rising card debt. The Federal Reserve signaled clearly at its most recent meeting that rate cuts are not arriving on the timeline markets had anticipated. Economists who 6 months ago were projecting 3 cuts this year have revised to 1 or none. Every month that elevated rates persist is another month that the carrying cost of household debt quietly compounds. You don't feel it until you need to move, and by then, the math has already changed underneath you. The behavioral freeze is the fourth layer, and it's the one that turns a set of manageable pressures into a structural problem. Research published by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, tracking consumer behavior across 4 post-war economic disruptions, found a consistent pattern. When households face sustained uncertainty across multiple cost categories simultaneously, they don't just cut discretionary spending, they delay major financial decisions entirely. Cars, home purchases, business investments. The individual delay makes rational sense. The collective delay becomes a self-reinforcing drag on the broader economy, which then creates the conditions for exactly the kind of prolonged disruption everyone was hoping to avoid. Here's the question most people won't let themselves ask. How many of those 4 layers have already touched your household, and how many are still arriving? 1 is already here. At least 2 more are in transit. The 4th depends on how long the others persist. This is where the preparation gap becomes the most important concept in this conversation, not because it's complicated, but because the math is unforgiving. A study analyzing household financial recovery across the 2008 collapse found that households who made even modest adjustments in the first 3 months of the disruption, not dramatic ones, not perfectly calibrated ones, just earlier ones, recovered their pre-crisis net worth on average 22 months faster than households who waited for the picture to clarify before acting. 22 months. Not because the early adjusters were smarter or wealthier, because compounding works in both directions, and the cost of delay is not linear. Most people hear a statistic like that and file it under interesting rather than urgent. That's normalcy bias at a different level, applied not to the threat itself, but to the cost of waiting. The mind that survived past disruptions tells you there's still time. There always was. That experience is real, and it is exactly what makes the current window so easy to miss. The window for early adjustment doesn't stay open. Let's talk about what the data actually shows when disruptions like this fully cycle through. Researchers at the University of Michigan tracked household financial outcomes across 4 distinct economic shocks: 1973, 2008, 2020, and the 2022 inflation surge, looking for the variables that most reliably predicted who recovered quickly and who didn't. The findings were consistent enough to be uncomfortable. Household income was a factor, but not the dominant one. Financial literacy was weakly correlated at best. The single strongest predictor of resilience was behavioral response time. Specifically, how many months elapsed between the first visible signal of a disruption and the first material adjustment in household financial behavior. The households that adjusted in month 1 or 2, even imperfectly, even modestly, recovered an average of 19 months faster than households that waited for clarity before acting. Not because their adjustments were larger, because earlier adjustments compound. Every month of delay is a month of compounding in the wrong direction. I'm not going to sugarcoat the worst-case scenario here, because serious economists are genuinely concerned about it, and you deserve to know what it looks like. The scenario is stagflation, rising prices and stagnating or contracting growth occurring simultaneously. It is the most difficult economic environment to navigate because the standard tools work against each other. Raising interest rates to combat inflation slows growth and crushes consumer spending. Cutting rates to stimulate growth pours fuel onto inflation. The Federal Reserve has no clean move, and the conditions that produce stagflation, an energy shock feeding a food shock, feeding a confidence contraction, all arriving simultaneously, are not a theoretical construct right now. They are the current trajectory if the converging pressures persist for another 2 to 3 quarters. The 1973 oil embargo produced exactly this combination. It took 2 years of economic contraction before conditions stabilized. The 1979 shock, smaller in absolute energy terms, produced a recession and inflation above 13%. The pattern is reliable enough that economists treat sustained energy disruption as one of the few dependable triggers for stagflationary conditions. Your nervous system wants to tell you this time is different. It always wants to tell you that. That wiring hasn't updated since the last crisis proved survivable. Here's what research on loss aversion tells us about why people freeze at the exact moment they should move. Work from Princeton's Behavioral Economics Group found that the psychological pain of losing money is roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining the same amount. That asymmetry means that under conditions of financial uncertainty, the amygdala, your brain's threat detection system, generates an overwhelming impulse to stop, to hold still, to wait. Not because waiting is rational, because movement feels like it could make things worse, and staying still preserves the illusion of control. The people who get hurt most in economic disruptions are often not the ones who made aggressive wrong moves. They're the ones who made no moves at all, who waited for certainty that arrived too late to act on. Let's talk about what you can control. The most important move right now is not the most dramatic one. It's not liquidating investments or making sweeping lifestyle changes. Research consistently shows that the households who come through economic disruptions strongest made quiet, unglamorous adjustments that nobody would post about. They trimmed discretionary spending before the pressure forced them to. They redirected those dollars toward financial cushion, high-yield savings accounts currently paying above 4%, accessible emergency reserves that provide psychological as much as financial security. When you know you have 3 to 6 months of runway, you don't make panic decisions. That calm is worth more than the interest. If you are investing on a regular schedule, continue. This is the instruction that feels most counterintuitive and is most consistently supported by evidence. When you invest a fixed amount each month, market volatility automatically lowers your average cost per share. The shares you acquire during a disruption like this one are, historically, among the best performing holdings over any subsequent 10-year window. The people who paused contributions during the March 2020 collapse and waited to re-enter missed a recovery that was complete within 57 days. They bought back in at higher prices and called it prudent caution. Audit your debt exposure with the current rate environment in mind. The Federal Reserve is not cutting rates on the timeline most households had priced into their planning. Every dollar of variable rate debt you carry through a sustained elevated rate period costs more than it did 18 months ago. Attacking high-interest revolving debt now, before the full weight of the other pressures arrives, is the kind of invisible adjustment that creates real financial distance between where you end up and where you would have ended up otherwise. Map your personal energy exposure specifically. Not in the abstract. How far are you commuting? What does a 30% diesel surcharge do to your shipping costs if you run a small business? If you were planning a major purchase that involves financing, what does a rate environment with no near-term relief do to that math? The answers are different for everyone. But the people who ask the questions in advance and build their responses around real numbers are the ones who don't get surprised. None of these moves are dramatic. None of them will make for an interesting story at a dinner party. The invisible adjustment, $200 redirected from dining out to a high-yield account, a pause subscription, a debt payment accelerated by 1 month, compounds over a 6 to 12-month disruption cycle into a gap that becomes very visible at the end of it. The 1% isn't a club with an application process. It's not a wealth threshold or an intelligence test. It's a decision, made before the pressure peaks, before the full picture is obvious, before the window for low-cost adjustment quietly closes. To treat the signals you're already receiving as real, you've already made that decision by getting to this point in the conversation. The only question left is what you do with the window that's still open.